Good evening to all of you who are joining us, members, avid readers, explorers of literature from across the ponds for our March 30th, 2021 Bengal Club Book discussion. I'm Julie Banerjee Mehta, for those who don't know me, and on behalf of the Bengal Club Library Committee and the Bengal Club, it is an absolute delight to welcome you all to what I think promises to be a pretty invigorating discussion this evening. The novel up on our plate tonight is A Pale View of Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro. I think he is one of the most understated yet most powerful writers today. Kazuo Ishiguro was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2017. In response to this honor, he had said, and I quote, "It's a magnificent honor, mainly because it means that I'm in the footsteps of the greatest authors that have ever lived. So that's terrific commendation. The world is in a very uncertain moment, and I would hope that all Nobel Prizes would be a force for something positive in the world as it is at the moment. I'll be deeply moved if I could, in some way, be part of some sort of climate this year in contributing to some of the more positive atmospheres at a very uncertain time." And this was 2017. Imagine how absolutely appropriate it is to remember what he said 4 years ago. On February 7th, 2019, Ishiguro received a knighthood for services to literature. Kazuo Ishiguro was born in Nagasaki in 1954 and moved to England with his parents when he was 5 years old. He was extremely close to his grandfather, and it was the hardest shard of reality to be cut asunder from that love of his life. His father, an oceanographer, was offered a prestigious position, and his mother prepared Ishiguro and his two sisters for a Japanese homecoming. Till he was 15, Ishiguro was ready for a return. In an interview after the announcement of the Nobel Prize, Ishiguro said, and I quote, "I've always said throughout my career that although I've grown up in this country and I'm educated in this country, a large part of my way of looking at the world, my artistic approach, is Japanese, because I was brought up by Japanese parents speaking in Japanese always at home. And I've always looked at the world through my parents' eyes." With his parents settled in Guildford, Ishiguro went to Woking Grammar School, where they affectionately called him Ishdawog and Ishdar. It was a very different England then, he says. People were very helpful to my parents. His heroes were Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, and Leonard Cohen. Music was a huge force in his life since he can remember. His dream was to be a dude in the music industry, and that's hardly surprising when you see the banquet of great music that was being produced right across Britain and the United States in the 70s, even the 60s. He realized this was only going to be a dream. So the next best thing was he wanted to be a writer. I do believe, after spending a decade studying his work and writing a dissertation for my master's about his fiction, it is this unkindest cut of having to be wrested away from his grandfather that made him grieve in his novels. All his novels, which reflect about separation. Separation from a homeland, exile from family, and irredeemable loss of cultural ties with his identity and his homeland. He took British citizenship only in 1983 and met Lorna, his wife, in social work at a homeless facility. They have a daughter, Naomi. She's just about 20 and already a published author who espouses her father's faith in compassion and compelling ways to tell a story. Like all our first loves, novelists, I do believe, notoriously return to their first novels in some pronounced or even subliminal way. I quote, "It is only in retrospect that events make a full impact upon us," says Ishiguro. Ishiguro maintains, "Nagasaki is not just a few hazy images for me. I remember it as a large chunk of my life." He left at 5. His stories are unique, fragile, and his first two pieces of fiction, A Pale View of Hills and An Artist of the Floating World, written in 1982 and 1986, Ishiguro dangerously brings up real evocations of Japan, and they are stunning in their understatement. The conflicted world of two Japans, one old and one new, which many of you are going to be talking about, is explored with the masterly skill of a lapidarist. That's how I like to think of him, as a jewel setter. Like many writers who are separated from their birthplace, recreated a Japan from the ellipses, the lapses, and the reconstruction of memory. Typically, the unstable narrator in A Pale View of Hills suggests the instability of the whole process of remembering. And it is who he said, I believe, it is not what we remember, but how we remember that fascinates him. In 1986, he abandoned Japan with a very English best-selling novel, Remains of the Day, for which he won the Booker Prize, as you might remember. So why did he not stay with Japan? A question I asked him on meeting him in Toronto. And he said to me, I felt it was time to explore other stories from other places. I had written what I wanted to write about Japan. Ishiguro's power as a writer about Japan comes from a memory bank that he carried with him when he left his homeland. At the time, although he was 5 years old, the complexity and the compulsion of his homeland stayed with him. For the Japanese, he is an outsider. This makes the author's own identity highly complex, especially because he is in exile and he is hybrid in a strange way, and yet searches for a Japanese homeland in this novel. The bombing of Hiroshima Nagasaki is a relentless ghost that returns to remind the women in this novel, Etsuko, Sachiko, and their daughters Keiko and Mariko, of the abjectness and horrors of war. So the theater of devastation and death is palpable through the telling. I had counted, I remember, 32 images of death when I was interrogating the deployment of the whisper of imaginings that is one of the hallmarks of Ishiguro's writing style. Particularly, I feel patriarchy, both American imperialism and Japanese patriarchy, suicides, the doppelganger of self and other, dead kittens, dead daughters, the whammy of the poverty that follows in the wake of the atomic bombing. All this finds a stubborn, understated presence in this first novel. No surprises then as to why at the age of 28, he won the Winfred Holtby Award for this particular novel. How Ishiguro perceives himself is evinced in an interview he gave to the Nobel Prize winning writer Kenzaburo Ui. I was very aware, I had very little knowledge of modern Japan, but still, I was writing books set in Japan, supposedly set in Japan. My very lack of authority and knowledge about Japan, I think, forced me into a position of using my imagination and also of thinking of myself as a homeless writer. I had no obvious social role because I wasn't a very Englishman, and I wasn't a very Japanese either. Perhaps Ishiguro's contemporary and very close associate and friend, Pico Iyer, whom we have explored in the Bengal Club book discussions, who is also a hybridized and displaced writer with a dual identity and focused on Japan, intermittently resides in and writes about Japan, might be given the last word on Ishiguro's rendering of Japan from memory. In an interview with me, Pico had mentioned that Ishiguro's Japan, and I quote, is akin probably to my India. In other words, a culture inhaled through inheritance, through family, through dim memories and presumed connections. In practice, he's hardly been in Japan since he was 5 years old. And I've never lived in India. But one of the exciting and liberating aspects of the modern age is that some of us, like Ishiguro and myself, can be outsiders everywhere. I would say they can be insiders too. So with that beginning, to put us all on the same page, I thought it would be interesting to watch a short set of images I've got together for you in a PowerPoint, and then launch on, as we do, first 3-minute responses from our Bengal Club members, and then from our loyal and insightful reader guests, 3 minutes each, so that we may have the felicity of multiple perspectives. I would urge each one of you to keep, please, that 3-minute stipulation. And I will, of course, invite each of you in turn. So, Gurudash, may we please start with the PowerPoint?
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. So I tried to get you pictures which show you a very different Ishiguro from the one we know now. And it is this image of Ishiguro that comes to mind when I remember Robert McCrum, the editor, the newly appointed editor in Faber and Faber, who met Ishiguro for the first time. And he was carrying a guitar and a typewriter. And he had this long hair and flowing, and he made an impression on Robert McCrum, and you know, the rest, of course, is history. The next one, please. So Ishiguro really did think that he was going to become a huge force in the rock music industry, and his favorites were Dylan and Joni Mitchell. And he tried very hard, but he realized that among the songs is a single sheet with the words, "I want to be a brilliant poet, musician," by the 8th of August, 1974. And that was the year that he was 20 years old. Next one, please. So while a student at Kent University, Ishiguro also kept a diary that records his gradual acceptance that I would fail in the music world, and the movement of my ambitions was towards literary projects. So a script for the radio play Potatoes and Lovers opened a new direction for him. And although it was not a successful submission for BBC Radio, he sent it in the following spring to Malcolm Bradbury when applying for his creative writing MA at University of East Anglia. And it was accepted, and he was so happy, because this is what caused the next phase in his life, to become a writer. Next, please. But it was really far away from the seminar room at the University of East Anglia that his personal breakthrough came through. And he says that he lived in this tiny little cottage with a farmer who had just gone through a divorce and didn't want to deal with anything from the real world. So he was given that space to think about how to write. And the surviving manuscript that he wrote there was waiting for Jay. And he figured out it was the beginning of a career. The archive reveals he wrote a second story, The Playground, but his wife, Lorna, called it shite. So he never published it. And these two stories were the result, he says, of locking myself away in a room for 4 weeks. And day and night, he wrote. And he felt, he worked out in his head how to write fiction by being on his own. Next, please, Kurodashi. So the history of Kazuo's own archive, I thought this was quite fascinating when I was researching him. In 2014, in totally unrelated papers, he says 86, 87 scribbles and upside down notes to himself about an artist of the floating world, which was written in 86. But he found it much later. And he says, I'm puzzled as to why some pages have writing upside down, completely forgotten. And he says, perhaps I did this work while traveling and I was short of paper. So I thought that, these are the little nuggets from, little known manuscripts, which become quite fascinating to those of us who like to see beyond the veneer. The next one, please. Thank you. Yes, so this one, these are the two quotes that I think are worth thinking about. He is an absolutely committed watcher of cinema. And he says that he has the whole 9 yards. So, the blinds, the collection, his own theater. And he says that in all the images that are flashed in front of him, he thinks of two things. One is, it's not what we remember in the case of either good cinema or good writing, but how we remember. And I think you can see that in A Pale View of Hills, because it's all about memory and how we reconstruct a story. And then he says it is only in retrospect that events make their full impact on us. So true. In the present, there is no time to think. It's only afterwards that you sort of look behind and you try to figure it out. Next one, Gurudash. So when he won the Nobel Prize, and I leave you with this thought, he says this is a very weird time in the world. We've sort of lost faith in our political system. We've lost faith in our leaders. We just hope that my winning the Nobel Prize contributes something that engenders goodwill and peace. It reminds us of how international the world is today, and we all have to contribute things from our different corners of the world. Thank you, Gurudash. I think we can leave our presentation. And I would like to give you the first 3 speakers today. I will start with Professor Atish Mitro in Montana because he has a meeting, as does Shutapa Banerjee. And then we will move to Ambassador Gurjeet Singh and take it from there. So Professor Atish Mitro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you for this summary and description.
Little louder, dear.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, the book is, to me, is not a comfortable read with its dissociated writing and unstable characters, sometimes characters which often break with all sorts of comfortable stereotypes that we have, even that of the most comfortable stereotype of all that we have of motherhood. It breaks with that all the time, and we are left with kittens being nonchalantly drowned and daughters dying and sometimes killing themselves in mysterious circumstances. However, once we get settled with the fact that this is not going to be a comfortable reading, one notices a lot. So the point I thought is that there is much left to the imagination of the reader. This is a book where we are constantly asked to think along with the characters. We are possibly invited to put ourselves in the shoes of people who went through the devastation of a war, of a very recent war. Maybe they were not characters in the war, but they were certainly displaced from well-established positions of comfort, both physical and emotional comfort, from their familiar situations. They were suddenly displaced into strange situations, as Sachiko often refers to her friend, and the narrator, of course, also. People, as you yourself noticed just now, that many people we have, they discuss of so many deaths as a direct or indirect effect of the war, and then the comfortable familiar order is displaced, and then people are sort of trying to make themselves comfortable in the new order. Then possibly, once we realize all this, I hope then possibly we could discount all these, the terrible apathy of Sachiko, for example, as a mother towards her daughter, which floats throughout the narrative. She seems to have very little motherly. She expresses very little motherly feelings throughout the narrative. So one gets puzzled and wonders if the narrator is narrating Sachiko's experience with her daughter Mariko, or is it herself sometimes talking of her daughter Kiko, who dies who we know has died of suicide. So it is very uncomfortable, and the threads are, well, as I said, we are asked to read this book with our own imagination and imagine things for ourselves. So it is disturbing, and I think we should constantly remember, as I said, the backdrop of the devastation they went through, which caused all these dissociative characters that flows throughout the book. That's my initial feeling. Yeah.
Thank you, mathematician, physicist. That's an interesting, pragmatic view. Let's move on to Shutopa Banerjee, who is a great aficionado of and champion of Ishiguro, very well read, not just Ishiguro, but one of, I think, the gems that we have from the Bengal Club archive of readers. And looking forward, Shutopa, to your explication.
Thank you so much, Julie, and a pleasure to be here. Yeah, you're right. He is one of my favorite writers, very, very dear to me. And I just loved your introduction. I knew a fair bit about him, but the little vignettes and the little quotes that you put added so much more to the person. So I've pretty much read his book almost in sequence as he wrote it. So, starting with A Pale View of the Hills, Artist of the Floating World. He's not a prolific writer. Remains of the Day, Unconsoled. And then I went to When We Were Orphaned. And then I came back to Never Let Me Go, which was pretty much the last book that I read. I also read his short stories, Nocturnes. The two I haven't read is The Burial and the recent one with the spectacular cover, which is like a work of art, Kazuo and the Sun. So I remember reading this book, and I remember the year vividly because I was working outside the country. And I would start by saying, I was actually reading Amitav Ghosh's Shadow Lines, and it's an outstanding book. And then I picked this book up. I was actually in Melbourne, and I picked this book up and I started reading, and I kept Amitav Ghosh aside because it draws you in. And that itself is a big comment, because, when you leave one really good book, which I realized after I finished that and read this, but I had to give a gap because this kind of absorbs you. And the way of absorbing itself was very different. This has a quietness to it. So everything about it was quiet. It quietly works its way into you. And I reread this book over the last weekend. And as he talks about memory, right? So I remembered vaguely the storyline. But when I reread it, it reabsorbed me in the same quiet manner as it did then. And this quietness to me, kind of becomes disquieting. And those are the disturbing elements of the book. And while it is, you can say it's a story of, a set of people having relatively disturbed lives in the aftermath of the atom bomb in Nagasaki. And now she's recollecting that sitting in England with her younger daughter. Ultimately, it sort of transcends that and covers so many things. The 2-3 things which I just want to touch upon, which have stayed with me even after this last reading, which was Saturday evening. So there is this image, and I kind of think in images, and to me, it's almost as vivid as if I can see it in front of me. This image of a thin woman on the banks of the river, drowning something, and then she picks it up and it looks like a baby. Gives me goosebumps even when I talk about it. There is the image of course, Mariko, who's so attached to those kittens, and that's like almost her life, and her mother putting them into the basket, and there's this foreboding, you know what's going to happen, and she does that, and the child running after it. That's the second. And the third, which appears twice, is about Etsuko running after the little girl, which she did so many times, Mariko, and something getting caught in her foot, and it's a piece of rope, right? And each time that comes up, and again, I get goosebumps even talking about it, the little girl, the fear in her eyes and her running away, right? And the whole thing unfolds in a manner, even the style, you know, it's not deliberately minimalist or anything like that because he comes from Japan. This is a story which is about people where, you know, it's almost, to me, the quietness kind of reflects in the lives that he's painting through the book, right? It's stripped bare of everything that is inessential, and you only get an essence of life and what is enduring. And in this book, to me, you know, the quality that endures in their lives is one which is sadness. And in many ways, how they try to accept and come to terms with that sadness. So that's really the enduring quality of the book to me. And that's probably not the nicest of way to end what I wanted to say. But, you know, to me, it's kind of left, while there are many other things, but to me, what I'm left with is almost this feeling that if not the most enduring quality of our lives, it certainly is one large element of probably human life. And when I say that, you know, it's also about Ogata, it's about Mrs. Fujiwara, it's about all of them. I'll end there, actually.
Thank you, Shutapa. And I just wanted to pick up on one image from there. Many writers, such as Michael Ondaatje, also Golden Booker Prize winner, like Mr. Ishiguro, say that they think in images. Those writers who started in cinema think in images. So that's an excellent point you brought up. Want to go back very quickly to the image of the rope that you brought up. To me, that connects to Keiko's hanging as well. So that's an added, you know, image that reconnects us to the images of death and to the racism. That rope always reminds me of that racist comment by British journalists when they found the story of Keiko. All they could say was she was Japanese and she hung herself in her room. So, Shutapa, excellent. You know,
I'll just add one small line to what you just said, very quickly. Yeah, you know, that open-ended ending, right? Where, yes, you know, it could be anything, the two parallel lives almost merging into one. That stays with you. That's all. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. It is a great pleasure for me and an honor that Ambassador Gurjeet Singh is here. As I said, he was serving at the Embassy of India in Japan the year A Pale View of Hills was published. And he's here with us today to share his lived experience of Japan in the early 80s. Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, a former Indian diplomat with 37 years of experience, has a formidable portfolio. He was ambassador of India to Germany, Indonesia, a whole bunch of places, Ethiopia, and his book, The Abalone Factor, written in 1997, was among the early books on India-Japan modern business linkages. He's trained in Japanese, that means he speaks Japanese, has been at the Embassy of India in Tokyo twice, 82 to 85, and 91 to 94. And you can see him pretty frequently, and he appears on TV commenting on Japan and India relations. Over to you, Gurjeet. Gurjeet, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Julie, for the rather friendly introduction, totally unmerited. But let me try and see now in 3 minutes, what can I say? So, okay, let me just talk about Japan in general about this. So one, whenever you say Ishiguro, you said people think in images, I think of a black rock because Ishi, rock, Kuro, black. So that is the name, Ishiguro. To me, it's always a black rock. Nagasaki, long cape. Ishiguro comes from Nagasaki. So what is Nagasaki? Nagasaki is the last city in the world to be bombed by a new weapon. Nagasaki is one of the cities which Japan opened through to the international world. So like Hokkaido, they had a city, Hakodate, there's Yokohama. There were a few cities opened where foreign ships could come. And Nagasaki became the center of Catholicism in Japan. So if you go to Nagasaki, which frankly is extremely difficult to get to even today, and I visited there in '83, you know, before taking you to the atomic memorials, they will like to show you the martyr to the 26 Christians, the crucifixion spot where 26 Christians were crucified. So openness, Christianity, lot of Portuguese influence, the tempura, all come from Nagasaki. Today, modern Nagasaki prides itself as an international living culture city. That is where Ishiguro comes from. Ishiguro leaves Japan in '64, you tell. '64 is when Japan actually modernizes. So the Olympic Games come to Japan, English signs start going up, the Shuto Expressway, Shuto meaning the ring expressway in Tokyo actually comes into being. The subways become more international. Japan has a new face in '64. But I think most relevant to the book is the issue of suicide. From '64 to 2003, the rising graph of suicide in Japan is a horrendous thing for any developed country to understand. This is the mix of modernity and tradition unable to live together. And if, as what the lady just before me said, that you know, this girl goes to live in England with her foster father. To my mind, my first reaction was, oh boy, she's going to die. I will read the book. That was my reaction. Can't fit in. Now, till 2003, the suicide graph keeps rising. From 2003 to 2015, it stabilized. But in 2007, there is an official white paper on suicides in Japan by the government of Japan, saying how we must do something to reduce the number of suicides down to 20,000 and then down to 16,000. Among the many things which happened, the pandemic ruined this objective of the white paper. During the pandemic, the number of suicides has boomed. The sense of anomie and loneliness in Japan is so deep today that I think about a month ago, the cabinet appointed for the first time a minister for loneliness. Now, I think the most lonely person in Japan is that minister. So he doesn't know what he's supposed to do. Because loneliness is such an un-Japanese word. Because Japan is a society. There is no scope for the individual. Ishiguro would never have been successful had he remained in Japan. So to be lonely in Japan, nobody wants to accept that this is acceptable in their society. So I think this acceptance that loneliness is possible is the realization that Japan is coming to terms that as a country, you can be isolated, but as a human being, isolation is much more difficult. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Gurjeet. Thank you. That was really an excellent psychological lesson from lived experience, and appreciate that very much. The next person we have, and who I'm very happy that he's on board always to give us the historical context, is Harish, Dr. Harish Mehta, who was incidentally the Mitsubishi Journalist of the Year awardee internationally, and spent a lot of time in Japan while he was writing a research booklet on the Japan-China relationship, the politics of Japan, and he visited Nagasaki several times, was resident, and was exploring the social psyche of Japan in the 80s. Harish, take it away.
So thanks very much. To come back to the book really is about the kind of Japan that the United States imagined, because pretty early on in chapter 3, we get to meet, in the course of a conversation between two characters, General Douglas MacArthur, who has just about imposed in the post-war years an American-written constitution for the Japanese. So the two characters are discussing the effects that MacArthur's imposition of democracy is having on the old Japan, and they're not happy. And the conversation between these two characters progresses. We learn that one of them is unhappy with the democracy and the democratic behavior of his Japanese wife, who is now not behaving in a very Japanese manner because she is choosing to vote according to her own conscience. And so the Japanese gentleman is now saying that, we live in the same home, but how can we live in the same home and then my wife is speaking about voting for somebody that I'm not? So in a nutshell, so these references to democracy and the new Japan versus the old Japan is a constantly recurring idea that pervades not only this novel, but a couple of other works that Ishiguro has written, which makes me conclude that one of his preoccupations, and very rightly so, is to kind of talk about how Japan emerges in the post-war period. And so the book really is set against this whole idea of the old Japan and Japanese ideas of the emperor, which is crumbling, and a Japan where everybody basically towed one line, and a Japan that was happy to go to war because the emperor wanted it to do so. So this collision is against the old Japan and a new Japan where some of these characters and their wives are now deciding to behave in a democratic manner. So the book is really setting it very nicely against the collision of the two Japans. And then as it unfolds, we get to know these characters better. And I'm sure we did think about the fact that, hey, there is a clash going on here between the characters. So with that, I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Harish. The old and the new, I'm hoping to hear much more from many more people, but you've set the baseline beautifully. Thank you very much. Anju, I know you have an excellent take on the mother-daughter relationship, and I think all of us would look forward to hearing that, Anju. Go ahead. Anju, you'll have to unmute, darling.
I always forget to unmute. Here I am. Thank you, Julie. It is not without reason that the names are rhyming. There's Kiko and there is Mariko. There is a kind of a similarity between the two mothers also. I would call them unthinking mothers with an emotional void, with a very, a very stubborn and a very icy attitude towards the daughters. Each one has a daughter. And I also think very strongly that what's her name? Sachiko's obsessive indulgence of Mariko is also in a way an effort to make up for the lack of attention towards her own daughter. Otherwise, whatever Mariko does, Sachiko is always there, observing her, worrying for her, fussing over her, So probably this is a way to make up for all that she could not do in the case of her own daughter. I mean, it was very surprising. Many a times I had to go back and reread the lines and understand, is it her own daughter who killed herself? It was a little difficult for me to accept the fact that a mother whose daughter is no longer there, who kills herself under tragic circumstances, is talking about it as a matter of fact incident, which happened. I also very strongly think, I don't know whether I should call it a metaphor or not. I think that Nikki she sounds like her conscience. And her father-in-law, who I think is the most loving character in the book, is a kind of a positivity that she sees in herself. It's a belief in herself. And Mariko is a metaphor for life, I think, which is it's mysterious. It is impulsive. Mariko as a metaphor for life. It's impulsive. It's uncertain yet childlike. It gets stopped by, like occurrences like the rope getting tied in the feet, the tragedy of time and destiny. This is Mariko's, like being a metaphor for life, which is full of these ups and downs, and strange incidents that happen. And as far as the mothers go, the emotional void and an emptiness that I'm talking about, it strikes you as something which is hard to accept. It's very difficult to accept. There is an iciness, there is a kind of a withdrawn attitude, a very stubborn perspective when it comes to raising up of her own daughter. So, and I feel that she makes up. It's an effort to try and make up for all that she could not do for her own daughter by way of being extra careful, extra loving, extra vigilant about Mariko.
Anju, we'll have to wrap it up.
I think I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, excellent points. That generational conflict, the doppelganger of self and other, you put it very well. Vivek, take it away. Vivek Krishna.
Yeah, trying to unmute.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. My first take on this month's book selection was disquieting, unsettling, a meandering stream of thought, the wanderings of an unhappy mind, a modern day ghost story. The storyline goes backwards and forwards seamlessly from England to Japan. Nagasaki is the setting in Japan in the aftermath of the atom bomb dropped on the city in August 1945. And it's the ghost of that calamity that infuses all the characters' lives. Sachiko and Mariko live on the riverside in a ramshackle wooden house, which had survived the devastation of war and the government's bulldozers. It can be seen from Etsuko's apartment, which is in itself one of those 4 soulless concrete blocks built on the burnt-out land. The worst days were over by then. American soldiers were as numerous as ever, for there was fighting in Korea. But in Nagasaki, after what had gone before, those were days of calm and relief. The world had a feeling of change about it. And yet, I remember an unmistakable air of transience there, as if you all were waiting for the day when you could move to something better. This conflict between the pre-war Japanese life and thought and the post-war American influence on modern education is etched into the interactions between Jiro, Ogata-san, and Shigeo Matsuda. The narrative style kept me off balance, full of foreboding, and this was a conscious stratagem of Ishiguro. For instance, the voice suddenly changing at the end of the book, with Etsuko, the narrator, suddenly appearing to turn into Sachiko. Or did she? Or were they just facets of the same person? And this same switch in the voice takes place right through the book. Suddenly, in the middle of a conversation, we are suddenly transported to another place, and people start talking about something else, basically between England and Japan. The story itself is convincingly conveyed in a female voice, with Etsuko, Sachiko, Nikki, or Mrs. Fujiwara, And this is an aspect of Ishiguro's mastery of language. All the male characters are secondary players, be it Jiro, Ogata-san, or Jiro's classmate Shigeo Matsuda. Indeed, Sachiko's uncle, or Etsuko's English husband, or Sachiko's friend Frank, we never even get to see. There are a number of ominous story threads in the book. 2 deliberate drownings, the young child in Tokyo at the beginning of the book, and the 3 kittens at the end of the book. 2 suicides, the ghostly unnamed mother of the drowned child in Tokyo, and that of Keiko in England. 2 hangings, the young girl around hanging from a tree after several children have been abducted and murdered in Nagasaki. And of course, Keiko in her rooms in Manchester. And then the 4 mother-child couples that seem to melt into each other. The mother-daughter in Tokyo, Sachiko Mariko in Nagasaki, Etsuko Keiko, and Etsuko Nikki in England. Is this memory stream of the narrator connected, manifesting itself into different characters to cope with grief and guilt? Etsuko says, memory, I realize, can be an unreliable thing. Often it is heavily colored by the circumstances in which one remembers. And no doubt this applies to certain of the recollections I have gathered here. Julie, thank you for sending me the message last week with a quotation from Ishiguro, which is quite revealing and brings the story full circle. As a writer, I'm more interested in what people tell themselves happened rather than what actually happened. Thank you.
Vivek, we are very lucky to have you on board. Each and every exploration of yours carries such unctuous, focused analysis. Thank you so much. Dr. Aparna Khastagir. There you are, Aparna. Go ahead. Unmute.
Hi, everyone. I've been listening to some very fascinating theories on this book. And honestly speaking, I've been blown away. But very shortly, what I find most touching in this story is the way in which repression acts as a psychological, it's presented as a psychological act, and it works as a defense barrier mechanism against the protagonist's painful experience. This is what catches my attention. And as I don't recall who said it, but there was a speaker who said that it's a very quiet study, and I too can't help but ponder over it. It is indeed a very quiet study of extreme emotional turbulence, which I find fascinating. And this book actually plays out Etsuko's thoughts and her conversations with the doctor, only living daughter, Nikki, while she recalls her past life. And it is through these conversations that she kind of tries to come to terms with her elder daughter's suicide. But what is very interesting is that there is a confusion of identity between the 2 girls, Mariko and Kiko, rhyming names, as a result of which we have an interpretive problem. And this interpretive problem is an extension again, in the sense that the characters of Sachiko and Mariko, we don't know whether they are real characters or not. We are never, revealed of their true identity. They may quite be fictional, very well be fictional characters onto whom the protagonist, projects her guilt in order to, prove to us, the readers, that she's not a bad mother at all. And she actually didn't abuse Kiko. And Ishiguro, so we see, is not very interested in solid facts. And because though the work is set in a geographical location and a historical time, the war is always in the background. It is conspicuous by being absent. And what is important is Ishiguro says that Etsuko's workings of her mind and her trying to come to terms with her past is what is important to us. And I'll just end with the final picture we have of the protagonist while she stands at the doorway and bidding goodbye to a very surprised Nikki. And the doorway can suggest 2 ways. If the door is closed, then that means she has been able to successfully close the door to her past. And if it is open, it might suggest that she has a new life to lead. And I'd like to end with these words. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. As usual, you're on the money, and the points that you bring forth, you tie up the threads of memory and forgetting, and how we remember is what Ishiguro is always trying to bring to the fore. And I gesture towards Vivek's final comments with Ishiguro's quote. Vivek, have you got that quote in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Will you read it out again, because it ties in beautifully with what everybody's said so far, and Aparna as well. Memory being the central point of exploration. Go ahead, Vivek.
As a writer, I'm more interested in what people tell themselves happened rather than what actually happened.
Thank you. Sangeeta, would you like to put your views on the table? Sangeeta Kichlu, lovely to see you.
Good evening, everybody. Well, this was, of course, not a story. The entire tone of the book was like, again, I would repeat the word, a quiet, mysterious musing. And while reading the book, since there was no sequence, one just went with the flow of the writing and the imagery. And when you finish the book, you were left completely bewildered. And this is the kind of book which you keep on thinking about long after you've read. And I know that I will draw many interpretations out of the book. This whole book is all about inferences rather than direct, direct relation of any event. You infer certain things, and it's up to the reader to make out what they want to make out of his writing. I think central to this book is the Nagasaki bombing and the effect it had on what is actually our generation and a generation beyond, and how the Second World War completely sort of de-anchored a very deep-rooted culture in Japan. And this generation is the generation that has been caught in this de-anchoring. And perhaps all the suicide and everything that comes with it is because of this. Yeah, so here again, Etsuko by herself is, if you see her, she's quite a very, she's a very cut in the sense there's nothing interesting about her personality as you read along. It is Sachiko and Machinko who are really the drivers of the story. And therefore, there is the constant question mark as to whether Sachinko's story is actually hers, because she really lands up in the West, in a Western country with a Western husband, and probably absolves herself of the guilt of possible cruelty or to.
I think we've lost Sangeeta. Gurudash, problem is not ours, right?
Yes, ma'am.
I think her connection is gone.
Yeah, connection must have gone. Okay, because we have some excellent potential voices, let's come back to her when she comes here, if she can come in. Our next, I think, is Dr. Paramita Mukherjee Malik. Paramita always has such positive things to say. I am, for one, looking greatly forward to hear the positivity of your exploration. Go ahead, Paramita.
Thank you, Julie Di. But I'll start with, like Professor Otish Mitra said, it was not a comfortable read. And I loved the way how Ambassador Gurjit ji said that, it's always the dilemma between the modernity and tradition, which couldn't go together. Maybe because of that, the number of suicides and all. And then I love the character Ogato-san, the father of Jiro, who is very much against defeatism. That's a wonderful thing. I think from there, my positivity again, springed up, because, it's in a life, you don't have to be a defeatist. You have to be, you have to think positive. You have to go forward. So when he tells his son that don't be a defeatist, be a winner. And that's what, gave me a lot of hope in this story. And and there are many beautiful pieces there, and like horrible pieces as well. But I want to end this by saying that because Nagasaki was bombed and it was in total rubble, but we can always go forward and look forward. And where Mrs. Fujiwara, the narrator Etsuko says, Mrs. Fujiwara always tells me how important it is to keep looking forward. And she is right. If people didn't do that, etc., etc., all this would still be rubble. And that's the beauty of the story, that Nagasaki has again been rebuilt after the atomic bomb. And I think human beings again and again and again, they come out of destruction to a new life, to a new beginning. So this new beginning gave me hope. So this is it. Thank you.
I would not have expected anything less from you, my dear. And it gives us hope, I think, when we look at Ishiguro's other works as well, Never Let Me Go. If any of you have a chance, read that. It's a futuristic, novel on cloning, on human organs being harvested. But there too, he has this incredibly rare quality for a 20th century, 21st century writer to undergird all that is unstable with a vision that gives you that little ray of light and hope. Moving on to Professor Choitali Mitro. Choitali, I am looking forward to your usual brilliant roundup. We've lost Sangeeta in the middle. I think she might be back now. And I'm just going to call once, Choitali, before I hand over the baton to you to wrap it up. Just wondering if Onushuya Pal is here. She had signed up. Onushuya, are you there?
I am here, but my Wi-Fi is very unstable.
Okay, try. You have 3 minutes, Onushuya. Go for it.
Thank you. After listening to all of you.
One sec. After you, Choitali will wrap it up for us, and then we'll move on to the guest readers who are going to be contributing very kindly. Go ahead, Onushuya.
Thank you so much, Julie, and all the panelists. It's been so nice listening to all of you. I really am at a loss for words, but I do want to say that right at the, a few days back when we did have a preliminary meeting, like I had said then, I didn't much really get a good feel while reading the book, and I was very disturbed right through. And I struggled to understand the very lack of warmth between mother and child in all of the instances that Ishiguro was mentioning. And it was almost like as if after moving to the West, she wanted to justify her detachment from her child and absolve herself of any kind of guilt after seeing the way other people related to their children. I felt that impacted her, and she felt the need to absolve herself of any guilt. Having said that, I kind of got the impression that with the Second World War and the damage that was done to Japan, and the references to all the families who had lost their near and dear ones in entirety and had to stand on their own, probably there was a deep-rooted phobia towards establishing bonds, even the most normal filial bonds that you are instinctively given to feeling. So they were consciously killing those bonds, not allowing attachment to take place for fear of the loss of that person. So that seemed to prevail throughout. And the only person who seemed normal was the father-in-law, because he had a bigger foundation in a normal living. And Nagasaki happened later in his life. Whereas for the rest of the generation, at a very young age, they were impacted by the devastation of Japan. So perhaps there is a whole lost generation, and this is just one layer being talked about, whereas it could be a common malaise present in that generation which survived the war and survived to see the destruction of their lives the way they knew it. So it gave birth to a new type of thinking, and it needed to be recorded. It needed to be put down as a part of the demographic, alteration that took place in Japan.
So no,
So,
Anusuya, we are a little out of time, but
yeah,
I must say, and point out to the audience that you have actually lived in South Africa. Am I right?
yes.
Yes. So you know the abjection, you know the
Yes,
devastation, right?
it is. And the sorrow of living in a space where you are not seen,
Yeah.
it can really destroy. And that's what happened to the elder girl who committed suicide.
Keiko,
She
yeah.
was not being seen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And unless you start to speak up and say, I am who I am, you have to see me for who I am, I think many people get lost.
Very refreshing, unique, very compelling exploration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you,
Anusuya.
all of you.
Okay, Choitali, looking forward to hearing your wrap up.
Thank you so much, Julie Di. It was absolutely stupendous to listen to the insights of everyone, and a big thank you for your excellent PPT. I would sort of say whatever I have been saying in the meeting that we did before, that memory I thought would be very, very important, and how memory can shape every individual's mind. And maybe it's not wrong to say that Ichuko is trying to give a visibility to her pain, to her repressions that she must have experienced. You see, if you list down these repressions, the list will be big. But just to sort of touch one or 2 points, one would be that the Japanese culture would have what we call Ryosai Kenbo, which has a Bengali equivalent of Shongshar Shukher Hoy Ramonir Gune. So everywhere, the woman will have no individuality and she will have to live within the family. So maybe this is sort of pictured as a desire to leave Japan, as you see in Sachiko. And the same repression comes through Itsuko also. Now, apart from this, you have the next repression would be that somewhere there was an insularity, which is so much a part of Japanese culture, and that gets juxtaposed with the open cosmopolitan culture of the West. And I thought that London as an international capital was sort of, it's all placed against and amidst an individual. And with this contrast, which is suggested, I think cultural displacement is always a sordid presence in the psychological world of Itsuko. That is important. And coming to the text, we have been talking about images, all of us. I just wanted to sort of talk about the image of the butterfly and the portion of the novel, the point of the novel where Mariko is teasing Isuko by pretending to swallow spiders. See, somewhere this idea of swallowing spiders, and then when the pet cat that is sort of lost, and the exact line, I have written it out, just allow me to read it. This cat we used to have could eat spiders. Now that was a very disturbing line. I think it has a connect with infanticide, estrangement, abandonment, which become so important themes. And finally, to wrap up, I would like to say that the sheer honesty of Ishiguro, because in that PPT, you did point us, and in one of his interviews, he talks about memory, speculation, and imagination. They should be down on paper before they disappear altogether. So this degree of honesty to remember, to respect memory, and to look and accept memory as whatever they sort of become with an individual's chemistry, I think that is the succeeding point of the novel. Nothing like it. Thank you.
Wonderful. As usual, on point and stunning. All right, let's now move on to our guests. Each of them, again, brings so much, each of you. So we start with Dr. Roma Bhattacharya, who needs no introduction to this group and has always, raised the bar to a very high level. Thank you, Roma.
Thank you, Julie Dee and Bengal Club for having me tonight. On a very personal note, years ago, when I first arrived at Oxford for my PhD DPhil studies, Remains of the Day was a major film hit. And I felt I'd entered into Ishiguro's world, both literally in the architectural splendor of the period setting of the film and the medieval Oxford colleges, but also metaphorically into the world of quiet intellection and refined English social manners, which felt like an extension of Ishiguro's consciousness lived firsthand, and not unlike Japanese polite society that I've also experienced firsthand in Tokyo. In both Japanese and English society, outward social interaction is measured and rehearsed. What distinguishes Ishiguro's writing, and very evident in this novel, is his interrogation of both these societies, choosing to explore instead the underground catacombs of human emotions, especially the concealed, the thwarted, and the unspoken, not unlike modern Japanese independent cinema. Ishiguro's genius is that his writing does this by inhabiting the silences and the spaces in between. Ishiguro himself, a child migrant from Nagasaki, Japan, uses creative writing, as we've all discussed, to reconstruct memory. In my view, his art is akin to the strokes of Japanese painting, especially ink wash painting, where the characters and the narratives are surreal and metamorphosed constantly, and are as elusive as the men and escape strategies in Sachiko San's life, whether the drunk American lover or elderly uncle. Ishiguro's voice, I would argue, is very Japanese, guised in the language of a Jane Austen-like objective narrator. His voice comes from a place of stillness. But within this garb of stillness, the novel haunts us with ink-wash paintings of the hidden mental anguish after Second World War of displacement, poverty, marginalization, invisibility, refugeedom, and the biggest displacement of all, exile, issues that I've worked with personally worldwide with the United Nations and war-torn countries. The little girl child Mariko's half-imagined dark world, alleyways and predatory women and men, and her real utter helplessness and hopelessness mirrored by the dark kittens that have to be finally drowned. The powerlessness of little Mariko is comparable to the girl child Yuri in Koreeda's film Shoplifters. The novel is framed by the slow revelation of Keiko's suicide, an eloquent comment on loss and exile that can never be erased. I would like to end by saying the tormented power of the unspoken is comparable to modern Japanese independent cinema. In both Japanese and English societies, sometimes that which is of real pith and moment in human life passes as a silent scream. This is what distinguishes Ishiguro's art. Thank you.
Thank you, Roma. Love that image of the Japanese brush painting and how you relate it to the understated and yet compelling style of Ishiguro. We've been talking so much about images and memory that this is, I think, the ultimate trope that ties in two genres of image and the written word. Thank you so much, Roma.
Thank you, Julie.
Sana, all the way from Toronto, tell us what you thought of A Pale View of Hills.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I appreciate everyone's comments so far. It's such a privilege to be able to listen to all of your comments. What I found most interesting about this novel was the author's focus on presenting a murkier, more complicated illustration of modernity and living in a modern world. The author demystifies themes that are often associated with optimism. So for example, moving to another country to pursue one's dreams, that is demystified in this novel. And I think this is a story behind the title of the novel, A Pale View of Hills. I think it's a reference to the instance in the novel when the protagonist gives her daughter a calendar image of her hometown in Japan, and she describes it as an old photograph. And it's sort of, the calendar has ripped out pages, and it's not something that she would have preferred to give her daughter and her friends, but it's this pale view of hills that is all that she has to offer. So a couple of instances when this sort of pale view is evident is when Jiro and his friends criticize the old ways of Jiro's father, yet they have regressive views themselves. They trivialize the experience of a woman for voting for a different political party than her husband, and then she gets beaten up for it. They trivialize this incident. Jiro is condescending to his wife. For example, when she congratulates him on his job performance, he frowns at her and tells her to make tea. So I think the author is perhaps making a point here that these characters are not as forward-thinking as they would like to view themselves, which is something that I found really interesting in this novel. Finally, the protagonist ends up leaving her husband and moving to England. And as some of you mentioned, she ends up repeating what she worried her neighbor's daughter would face in terms of neglect and unhappiness. So I think that this sort of ties in with this making murkier, demystifying these themes that I think are often represented in more pristine and optimistic ways. And this is what I found most interesting about this novel. And I'm happy that we had the opportunity to read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana. You actually have brought a new focus on the fictional genre, and that focus is, Sana, the idea of colonialism, the idea of colonialism that is projected through patriarchy. And that little instance where the nuance where when Etsuko congratulates Jiro on his promotion, that he should tell her, go and make some tea, like, you know, woman, what are you talking about? You know,
right.
What do you understand about the corporate world? So in a way, Sana, what you are bringing forth, as you were speaking, I was thinking for all of us, it's a kind of trope that you can connect to the fact that the Japanese constitution was rewritten after the war. And I think Harish will bear me out on this if he's around. The fact here, what you are doing is in fact, Sana, unveiling another level that the writer might have thought of, that the American patriarchy towards the Japanese after the loss of the Japanese in the war, and America saying, hey, you know, we will tell you where you stand, we will tell you. So I don't know, Harish, what do you think? Is it right that America did write their constitution post-war?
Yeah, pretty much. The constitution of Japan, the constitution of a defeated Japan of a Japan that had been nuked twice was written by Douglas MacArthur and his advisors. And they tried to create a new country out of the rubble in the American image to the extent possible, because they had seen the militarism of the Japanese emperor, and they did not want Japan to ever get to exercise that kind of military power, where they were killing children with bayonets in Singapore, throwing them up in the air and catching them with the bayonets.
Yeah.
So the army was vicious. It was worse than, or probably worse than what the Myanmaris are doing today. We've seen, we've seen the worst of Japan, and so therefore the idea was to kind of pastoralize them, to send them back to the pastoral era, pretty much the same way as the Allies dealt with the Germans at the end of the Second World War, at the end of the First World War rather, when they imposed all these heavy war reparation damages, and denied the defeated German emperor, the king, from ever getting to exercise military power or to even have an army.
Got it. Thank you, Harish. The point that I was trying to get your nod on was this wonderful parallel that you can see, Sana. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, yes. It's very interesting. Yeah.
And as you were speaking, I was thinking for us whether it is actually also a thought by a diasporic writer that the patriarchy is on several levels going on here,
Exactly. And I found the contrast between the father-in-law and
Jiro,
the husband. Yes, I found that very interesting, the contrast there.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You've given me something to think about. Okay, moving on. Raka Mukherjee. Raka's in a final phase of her master's, Touche, at Loreto College. Looking forward, Raka, go for it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So the subject I'm going to speak about and take up today has been spoken about for the past 1 hour. So I'll quickly jump through my quotes and I'll quickly jump to the points. So for me, the novel begins with Etsuko's self-admitted warning of her failing memory, which situates the readers to perceive the narrative as a pastiche of collective anecdotes that connects the post-war Japan of her past and present-day England. As she says, that memory, I realize, can be an unreliable thing. Which brings me to the unreliable narrator and the use of memory and the doppelganger in the novel. So the doppelganger here is truly situated in the characters, which I felt in Keiko and Mariko. And as perceived by Etsuko, and on several instances, the undergirding element of horror, loss, and overcoming the grief of being lost in the multicultural maze of home and other. So the suicide of Keiko, living estranged in Manchester, the alienation is paralleled in Sachiko's abandonment of her daughter Mariko. Mariko's constant hallucinations of the older woman who drowned her baby and who committed suicide in the act of harakiri, as Dr. Mehta kindly mentioned in her master's thesis. And, it reminded me of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, where the little children, Miles and Flora, they are hallucinating. And perhaps memory and apparition are the literal ghosts from the past. And this act as a collective symbol of horror that was on Japan, the angst of losing home and never belonging. I'm going to quickly go through perhaps 3 instances where we see that maybe Etsuko and Sachiko were not so different, but the same person. So an instance where she recounts overhearing 2 women talking about the newcomer in a tram stop. They discussed for a while her American friend, and the woman spoke again of how unfriendly the stranger had been to her that morning. And her immediate response, "It was never my intention to appear unfriendly." So the defense that Etsuko makes for Sachiko here makes us question that perhaps Sachiko might just be another fragment of her own self. And if we apply George Poulet's theory of the split self, we'll see that the pronouns also shift in this narrative. The incident about Mariko and Etsuko, or perhaps the little child having a conversation, and where she says that, if you don't like it here, we can always come back. So she uses the word we. Why is she using the word we here? Because we don't know if the little child is Mariko, if the little child is Keiko, or if the little child is the collective relationship, as I keep coming back to the word, of so many Japanese women and their daughters and their families who have been estranged from their home and who have to be relocated. And, the final instance of the doppelganger is fully achieved in the image of the Pale View of Hills, the picnic, where at the end of the novel, the memory of the trip that Sachiko, Mariko, and Etsuko had taken transcends to the line, I was just remembering Keiko was happy that day. We rode on cable cars. It's just a happy memory. That's all. This line makes the readers realize that perhaps all this while, Etsuko was talking about the struggle that her elder daughter faced in relocating. Makes me think of Sujin in the Midnight at the Dragon Cafe by Judy Fong Waits, and perhaps the collective suffering of the women and children who had to leave America. And the culture shock and the trauma that is manifest is probably Etsuko's guilt because she could not give her own daughter the home, the security, the space after they relocated. And there's a lot of the element of memory is here healing. The disquiet, the calm comes from the usage of memory, like in Bryony in Ewan McEwan's Atonement, or Tom in The Glass Menagerie, where Etsuko manifests her guilt of not giving her elder daughter the home and life she deserved through narrating Sachiko and Mariko's story to her younger daughter, to cope with the self that was the self that she was and the self that she wishes she would become in the Eliotist echo, knowing myself yet being someone other from Little Gidding. So thank you so much, ma'am, for choosing this text, because although it is disquieting, although it is disturbing, we get to experience the lived experience of the women, of the horrors of war, and of not being able to find a home. Thank you so much.
Very wise head on able shoulders. Fascinating, Raka. Thank you. May I call upon Mr. Harsh Kumar Singh, who is a young scholar with a lot of promise. Harsh, looking forward. Go ahead. Harsh, unmute, dear.
So thank you, people of the panelist, for having me here. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to speak about the storytelling elements and how the Japan is presented, especially Nagasaki, by the author. A Pale View of Hills set during the reconstruction of Nagasaki. Okay, and this rebuilding is not just a commitment to civic renewal, but a forceful burial of a hushed up past. And we find that there is a self-induced amnesia, with the events of the war being too painful for survivors to discuss. Even Ishiguro had said in an interview with Mr. Sean Matthews that I am not interested in writing about storytelling, but I am interested in storytelling in the sense of what a community or a nation tells itself about its past, and by implication, therefore, where it is at the moment and what it should be doing next. So, although debatable, it can be said that the storyteller here is reinvented, but it is in the guise of the history teller, okay, and as the very agent of redemption that Irving Wolfhard had talked about. The older face of fate indeed crushes the morality and traditional values of the people of Nagasaki, and they have to succumb to the new shape of things. To really explain the condition of people, would be to quote from Hannah Arendt, who claims in Men in Dark Times that the world has become, and I quote, inhospitable to human needs. Ishiguro's method of storytelling is, in fact, like Arendt's concept of political theory as storytelling, where it is a form of storytelling which seeks to immerse its audience in thinking critically about a given issue while visiting different perspectives without any care about consensus or assent. Since Ishiguro was inspired by films, as you had said, a comparison may be drawn to the Shomengeki genre, especially to Yasujiro Ozu films, okay, whose elements of domestic setting and elegiac mood or mono no aware, that is the pathos of things that brings forth the themes of nostalgia for the past and wistfulness, can be seen in his work. And even another literary topos, which is found in the Shomengeki genre and in Ishiguro's narrative, is the transience of life. An unmistakable air of transience is not only there in Etsuko's apartment, but in her narration and recollection too. We find that in the novel, characters reaffirm relentlessly the need for optimism because that is all that they are trying to get. Mrs. Fujiwara also says that you must keep your mind on happy things now, your child and the future, to Etsuko. An emulation of all that the America of those times was is portrayed through the apartment blocks, ideas of democracy, and these represented all that was new and challenging. However, America and the Western world itself, even after many years of Etsuko's moving to English countryside, suffered from myopia and bigotry because we find Etsuko saying the English are fond of their idea that our race has an instinct for suicide, as if further explanations are unnecessary. This idea of seppuku or harakiri is also found in Ishiguro's story, A Family Supper, which plays on the stereotypes related to Japan, especially of suicide. The narrative of the book is about how someone talks about things they cannot face directly through the other people's stories as well. Okay, we find that Japan is presented in a way where the gap exists between the older and younger generation. Okay, which is not just in this novel but also in the sequel, An Artist of the Floating World. So Ogata-san and Ono in the Artist of Floating World lament the loss of discipline and loyalty. Japan becomes a very fractured place, more so since the people do not really foresee a future. Even the very contradictory images of the high-rise apartment blocks and the presence of insects, mosquitoes, and waste ground in front symbolizes the facade of Japan's progress with the murky past, which is leeching the people who are just putting on a brave face, with people like Sachiko, if she did exist at all, living in denial of reality, the victimization of humanity, and that there is no escape for them is what Ishiguro feels the most sympathy for, and which is what he showcases in most of his novels. Thank you very much for having me here.
Absolutely brilliant, Harsh. This is the first time I've heard you explore a novel, and I must say that it's a great job done. Loved your film connections, and Hannah Arendt, who is one of my favorite theorists. So I think Ritu Gulati, are you here? I don't think Ritu is here. So a good wrap up, Shebunti. Looking forward to what you have to say, Shebunti. Shemgupta is our very prized librarian. She's been around, for 20 years at the library. And we are so happy to have her on board and championing this book club. Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Rajesh Mehta. Although Ishiguro's work is a work of fiction, yet I would like to draw a parallel between Wilfred Owen's poetry and Ishiguro's work, from the point that, as all of us know, that Owen's poetry lies in pity. Similarly, this particular book also lies in pity, from the point that a much young life who could have prospered much has in this particular book has died an unnatural and a premature death. Ishiguro therefore not only talks about the ephemerality and uncertainty of human life, but he also very poignantly brings in the focuses on loneliness, which is key to modern literature. And therefore, I would like to say that this book keeps on haunting a reader long after one has finished reading. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Shebonti. The book stays with the reader long after we have read the book. I mean, what could be a better compliment than that? I am over the moon every month when I see all of you. You know, you are just amazing, amazing people. And we've stuck with this bunch of people for the last three months now, I think, Shebonti, where most of us have come back. And there are a couple more of us who they've been there since the origins. So looking forward, we'll choose a biography, a non-fiction piece, since I'm being asked, why are you so leaning towards fiction every time? So Vivek and Anusuya, Paromita, all of you, Anju, from the club, I will send you, as I will send our regular guest readers as well, the name of the title and send you the PDF so that we can meet in April and do this together. April 23rd is a red letter day for us. It's Shakespeare's birthday and we are trying to put together something. So I hope all of you will join in and tune in.
Sorry, didn't get you. Whose birthday?
Shakespeare, the bard.
Shakespeare. Shakespeare. How wonderful. Thank you. Look forward to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, all of you. I can't express, you know, how enriching, enhancing, and how connected we all feel with a good book. I think that's a great connection. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Many
Bye-bye.
thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Mama.
Julie.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, Julie.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're so welcome.
Thank you, ma'am.
See you again. And Harsh, you've been a very good find. Stick with us.
Sorry,
Okay. Good night, everyone. Good night.
Goodbye. Bye, Julie.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Julie.
Bye. Sangeeta, next time.
Yeah, you know, my connection just went post. It was so annoying.
Yes.
I had to choose my time to go. Anyway, I came back soon thereafter. It was
Yes,
really
I
great.
saw you. We will factor this in next time. But you know, we had so many voices today.
Yeah, so there was
I
enough.
didn't want to waste any time.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye,
Good
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.